Welcome to the new video, and in this video we will discuss about the job description of a regulatory compliance officer. Job description means the roles and responsibilities of a compliance person or compliance specialist. When we talk about the compliance officer, we mean the compliance team member, and the compliance head is also known as the compliance officer or the chief compliance officer. So the broader roles and responsibilities of the compliance officer include: number one is the development of compliance program. Compliance program means the consolidation of all compliance related policies, procedures, regulatory requirements, applicable laws, etc. So the compliance program is developed considering the relevant operations and the business dynamics of a particular institution, such as, for example, if we talk about the bank. So the compliance program of the bank would include the applicable laws and regulations that are prescribed by the central bank or the regulatory authorities that supervises the banking industry. Compliance officer also develops compliance related policies and procedures. For example, if we talk about the financial institution, then the compliance policies would include the anti-money laundering policy, know your customer policy, third party due diligence policy, sanctions policy, and the compliance reviews policy, account opening and account closing policy, etc. So the development of compliance policies and procedures is also the responsibility of the compliance officer. Compliance officer also maintains the regulatory repository or the database of applicable laws and regulations. And the purpose of repository is to ensure that the applicable regulatory requirements are consolidated in a centralized position or in a centralized manner, so that the access to the relevant provision of a law or a regulatory requirement can easily be made by the compliance officer or the person who is required to comply with that particular law or regulation. So the database is also maintained by the compliance officer. Let's suppose if the bank is required to comply with anti-money laundering, know your customer, account opening and closing, sanctions policy, or the sanctions related laws and regulations, then the compliance officer would develop the repository where the applicable compliance related anti-money laundering, sanctions, and other requirements would be consolidated in a centralized position or in a centralized manner, so that the access to the relevant law and regulation is made easy for the stakeholders or the employees. Compliance officer also coordinates with the senior management like the chief executive officer and the chief operating officer of the institution and the departmental heads who supervises different functions like the operations area, information technology area, or you can say the risk management area, treasury, general banking, etc. So the compliance officer coordinates with the management and departmental heads and other employees or stakeholders, and the purpose of coordination is to identify the compliance status, to assess the understanding of the management, departmental heads and stakeholders about the applicable laws and regulations, and to determine the compliance status in different functions of the institution. So compliance officer on a periodic basis coordinate with the management, departmental heads and stakeholders. Further, compliance officer periodically performs different kinds of reviews, like the reviews of compliance policies, and the purpose of review is to ensure that the policies are in compliance with the latest applicable laws and regulations. And if the policies are not found including the relevant laws and regulations, then the compliance officer would initiate the changes to the compliance policies and procedures with reference to relevant and applicable laws and regulations. Compliance officer also assesses the effectiveness of the implemented compliance controls, because compliance controls are necessary to ensure that the institution is complying with the relevant law or regulation. Let's suppose if the anti-money laundering regulation requires the financial institution to obtain the relevant information from the customers as part of the customer due diligence, to ensure that only legitimate customers are onboarded and only the accounts of those persons are opened who are found legitimate, then The compliance control would be in the form that the relationship manager of the bank would be obtaining the relevant documentation from the customer before opening the account, and the information would then be identified and verified from different reliable sources. So this would be the compliance control. I just gave you an example here. Before proceeding, if you have not subscribed this channel, I would request you to please subscribe this channel for a timely videos notification, and that will be great if you share the video with your relevant colleagues for better understanding about the regulatory compliance officer's role. So let's continue. Compliance officer also performs compliance risk assessment, and when we talk about the compliance risk assessment, we mean that the identification of relevant compliance risk areas and assessing the inherent and residual position of the risk, and accordingly during the process of performing the compliance risk assessment, compliance officer assesses the effectiveness of controls and then performs the residual risk assessment. uh, After performing the compliance risk assessment, compliance officer basically identifies the critical and significant compliance risks that must be addressed by the institution to avoid the compliance breaches and fines and penalties from the regulatory authorities. So, compliance risk assessment performance is one of the key requirements of the laws and regulations. Therefore, compliance officer in the financial institutions perform compliance risk assessment on a periodic basis. Compliance officers also coordinates with the regulatory authorities for different purposes, like when the inspection team of the regulator visits the financial institution, then the compliance officer coordinates with the team and provides the necessary documentation for their review, provides the necessary evidence of the compliance work performed during the year or during the period, and the compliance officer also responds to the regulatory authorities on their different questions. The coordination with regulatory authorities is also one of the job roles of the compliance officer. Compliance officer also performs periodic compliance checks and reviews of different departments, and the purpose is to ensure that the employees are working as per the compliance requirements. And the compliance officer also documents compliance related breaches and issues that he or she identifies during the periodic compliance reviews, and the documentation would serve as a basis for the compliance risk assessment, and the identified breaches would then be addressed on a priority basis to avoid future compliance breaches. Compliance officer also identifies the root cause analysis of the compliance breaches, because the identification of root cause analysis is very significant and very crucial here. And once the root cause is identified, the compliance officer develops or instructs the management or provide guidance to the management for the development of relevant controls to avoid or to mitigate the root cause of the compliance breach. Compliance officer also provides regulatory compliance training to the employees, because this is also one of the requirements, and the compliance officer develops different compliance programs, different compliance training programs, and in those compliance training programs, compliance officer focuses on different kinds of applicable laws and regulations, compliance obligations on the part of the employees, and the compliance controls, the requirements laid down in the compliance policies. So all the broader and key areas are included in the compliance training program, and then compliance officer arranges the compliance training sessions for the management and employees, and the purpose is to educate the employees working in the institution about the compliance culture, applicable laws and regulations, and the compliance obligations. So these were the broader compliance officers' roles and responsibilities. I would again request you to please subscribe this channel for videos notification, and thank you for watching this video.